So as some of you might have noticed, I'm a woman. I'm white. I have a disability. And when I think about politics and when I talk about politics, a lot of those identities come into it. So when I think about austerity, I look at how austerity affects certain groups more than others. So in particular, austerity affects women. 82% of all cuts that the government have made impact women. If you look at the pay gap, for instance, women are paid less than men. But if you narrow it down, black women are paid a lot less than other people. So when you think about politics, identity does have to come into it because everybody experiences things differently, personally, but also in terms of economics, in terms of how it affects the community, etc. And when I think about the people, well, when I come across the people who complain about this, it always seems to be exclusively boomers. Sorry. I am closer in age to Kamal's daughter than Kamal. So I am of the generation that is partly interested in identity politics. And I don't think it deflates things. I think people live their life in a normal way. And obviously your identity is part of that. So everything that affects you, everything that makes up the person that is you, including your likes, your hobbies, your dislikes, etc., it all comes together to form a whole person. And I don't think that talking to people and understanding that people have different views, different experiences of life, because of different identities, I don't think it actually deflates things. I don't think it puts people in a box. I think it allows us to be more expansive with policy. I think it allows us to look at political policy and think about how different groups will be affected by it, and therefore stop discrimination within that kind of thing. There is a huge amount of concern about universities, about people being no-platformed, about people not being allowed to speak, etc. And I always find it really, really fascinating that so many people get upset by a small number of students in a student union when almost nobody else will have heard of these small societies, these small groups. And I think the big problem is that we have older people who have columns in big magazines, huge access to the media, constantly saying that they are being silenced. I know this because they write constantly that they are being silenced. They go on TV to talk about the fact that they have been silenced. And, I think if they were, I wouldn't be constantly hearing about them. And I think actually identity politics helps those people because it allows them to constantly place articles in The Spectator, in Spiked magazine, in all sorts of places, talking about the fact that they have been silenced and that identity politics is ruining their life, etc. Thinking about Lionel's speech, I have a lot of friends who are white men, and I don't look at them and think, good Lord, you're so privileged, it's disgusting. Because they are my friends, and I don't think of people, in small, I don't put people in small boxes. I don't look at them as having a tick box on their chest that explains things about them. I think that, for instance, me having a disability changes my life somewhat. I'm in hospital a lot. My friends know that and come and see me. But it doesn't really change anything else. I might need some things like, for instance, if we decide to have strobe lighting here, I wouldn't be able to sit on stage. But that's about it. Don't do that. And I find it really, really fascinating that the big panic comes from older people, a very, very small number of older people who, Lionel was saying that the people who are into identity politics are relatively wealthy, tend to be white, etc. But whenever I read articles about people being silenced, about people being kicked out by identity politics, it's always homeowners in their 50s. It's always people who are relatively comfortable, haven't lived through the global financial crash didn't really affect them. And it seems, it seems such an obsession with those people. I've met people who were absolutely desperate to get removed from panels just because they wanted to talk about the backlash that came with it. And they knew that if they were removed from a small panel in Students' Union, they could make a huge amount of money talking about it. Going on the BBC, talking about how they were silenced, writing in The Spectator about how they were silenced. And absolutely nobody at any point thinking, why... Clearly they aren't. Clearly this person's being published everywhere. I think identity politics is actually really, really helpful in terms of making sure that we think more deeply about how policy affects people, about how we can stop gaps in admissions to university, how we can stop people being paid less, how we can look at the fact that if you are disabled, you are less likely to get a job, and how we can change things to bring other people in. And I think that we have to move past the terrifying fear that a lot of boomers have around this. People. When I look at my friends, I don't have a tick box in my head that appears like some kind of sci-fi thing that breaks down what they are and who they are. We might have conversations about so I was having a conversation with my friend the other day about the fact that they had been the victim of a homophobic attack. But identity doesn't always come up, and sometimes it does. And I think it's a lot more useful to talk about it and think about how discrimination happens and how we can stop that from happening. One really, really key bit, I think, David will talk about this, is university admissions. So, for instance, Oxford, had a huge race problem. They have a huge class problem, and bringing that up and talking about it means that they will actually take some action and think about that. There have been some court cases where people have looked at the fact that certain policies are bound to affect women, therefore they are discriminatory. Other policies, for instance, like exclusively seem to hit disabled people, and those people have gone to court and talked about the fact they've been discriminated against, and often won the cases and changed the policy. So I think that if we want to have a more equal society, there is no way we can do that without thinking about identity, without thinking about how certain things mean that other people find it harder to get into certain jobs, find it harder to reach certain things, or even come into a building because there isn't a wheelchair ramp. So I think that identity politics is not about deciding who is the villain, who is the most privileged, who we should never ever talk about and attack and talk about their privilege. I think it's much more about making sure that our society is more welcoming to people and that political policy doesn't discriminate against individuals and big groups. It does at the moment. Austerity massively affects women, and it massively, if you are a woman and you are disabled, you're doubly discriminated against by certain policies. That is identity politics, and I think we need to remember that if we are making policy, it needs to be more equal. It needs to make sure that, for instance, if you are a young black person and you're applying for a certain job, or a place in the university, you aren't discriminated against by the way that the interview takes place. And so I think identity politics is about equality. It's about making sure that everybody has the same access, and that access might be slightly different based on their identity. And I think that it's led to a lot of people thinking more deeply about how they act and how society should be built. So I'm against the motion. I think that we should be more equal, and I think that identity politics is key to that. We can't move past identity. We can't ignore identity. And I think that maybe at some point the boomers will understand that.
Thank you very much, Dawn. Thank you very much. Our next speaker for the motion Trevor Phillips, to my right, was chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission between 2003 and 2012. The co-founder of the diversity analytics consultancy, Weber Phillips, and he is presently chairman of the Index on Censorship. He's a director of the Barbican Arts Centre and vice president of the Royal Television Society. Trevor.
Well, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I didn't really, to be absolutely honest with you, I didn't really know what Intelligence Squared was before I was asked to be part of this. It's a tribute to their organization that this number of people can turn out on a lovely evening where you could be doing something much better to listen to us. Thank you so much. So let me introduce myself. I'm the 10th of 10 children of an immigrant family, came here in 1950. We're descendants of slaves, including a woman, the earliest known member of our family. She was called Happy, presumably some slave owner's idea of a great joke. Further back, we would have come from the Mandinka or Fulani people of West Africa, like David. He also comes from Guyana. That's a whole other identity story to tell you, but we're great. My ancestors were therefore Muslims. But of course, we had all that whipped out of us, probably in our case by the biggest plantation owners in British Guiana, John Gladstone, yes, the father of the Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone, and the largest single beneficiary of compensation after abolition. I also have a professional identity. I used to do TV. Don't do much these days. I've only made 3 films in the last 20 years. Before that, with my brother Mike, I wrote the book and made the series which told the Windrush story first. Today, I occasionally write for newspapers and magazines, but mostly I'm basically a boring businessman. I chair a talent business called Green Park, and for the past 4 years, I was president of the Council of the John Lewis Partnership. I run a small data analytics business, which is probably a legacy of my time as a chemist when I was young. I said all that out to try to explain why I come at this debate from the way I do. My background may explain some of what I say. I agree with some of what Dawn said, by the way. Identity is more important because it now represents some real interests that, for the first time in many centuries, has a voice. Women, obviously. Minorities. When my father came here, the white family who lived across the road could afford to be friendly with us. They knew that no matter how clever my dad was, how hard he worked, how ambitious he might be, when it came to getting a job or a house or a loan, we would never be ahead of them in the queue. That divided us from them. Not income, not the area we live, but that thing. That thing. And by the way, it's not just poor people of color who suffer, because we'll have an argument, no doubt, about class here. When I was chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality, the people who were most affected, who wept in my office, were not young black men harassed by the police. They were the teacher who knew that because he was black or Asian, he would never become a department head. The lawyer who knew that no matter how clever she was and how hard she worked, she was never going to take silk. And the doctors who knew that they would always be junior doctors and never consultants. They had done everything that this society asked of them, everything. But the prison of their skin kept them in a place that meant they would never reap the rewards of their diligence. So I understand all of that. And if that's all that the identity politics were about, well, this would be a short debate. We could all say we agree. There are some other things that it's not about. I was the NUS president who wrote and moved and persuaded the NUS conference in 1973 to adopt the no-platform policy. We wanted to keep fascists off campus. Nobody today thinks that Germaine Greer or Julie Bindel should be in that category. We can agree about that. Nobody today thinks that white men should continue staging the sit-in they do in the boardrooms of our great companies, except them. We don't have to have an argument about that. And nobody believes that it's okay to abuse public figures. I got my first bagful of hate mail when I became the NUS president in 1978. I was 24 years old, and I had a whole bag full of it, including a charming cartoon which drew my own lynching. Nobody will argue that that should be part of our politics, so I don't think we need to devote a lot of time to all of that. Nor should we spend a lot of time comforting ourselves with the thought that we're virtuous and there are folks out there who aren't. The fact that none of us is Nigel Farage doesn't let us off the hook on this issue. Clever and nice people can be racist too. Albert Einstein called the Chinese an industrious, filthy, obtuse people. One of my friends and somebody I admire in politics once called on the government he led to ensure British jobs for British workers. We may tonight talk about institutional racism or sexism. Stokely Carmichael came up with that phrase for a very specific reason. It was a critique of Martin Luther King. Carmichael said that the point he was making was that racism was so baked into society that you could have a police force full of black angels and they might still be shooting black people. Everybody said, don't be ridiculous. 50 years on, the killings of young black men all over the USA, often by black police officers, says that Carmichael was right. So tonight, this is really, for me, about politics and its place in society. There's only one reason for politics to exist, and that is to help us solve problems. Now, for over a century and a half, our political architectures followed economic and social divisions, workers to the left, bosses to the right. But we're in an era of extreme, possibly unprecedented disruption. And the real tribal divides in our society symbolize the deepest differences about what kind of people we want to be. I'm a Remainer, pro-globalization, massively pro-immigration, pro-technology, socially liberal, London-centric. You'd expect that. But I don't disrespect my many relatives who live in, say, Essex or Nottingham, who feel just as passionately anti-globalization, cautious about immigration, and that includes my black relatives, anti-digitization, and who loathe London's arrogance. A survey taken after the referendum asked about people's attitude to various topics. On the economy, on capitalism, there was absolutely no difference between Remainers and Leavers. 51% thought capitalism was a force for ill, 49% force for good. Asked about multiculturalism, 71% of Remainers thought it was a force for good, 81% of Leavers thought it was a force for ill. 60% of Remainers were pro-feminism, lower than I'd expect. 74% of Leavers were against feminism. My point is, it is these issues of identity that are dividing us. This debate is really about one thing. Identity politics is a politics that is tearing our society apart. I think that's objectively true. But perhaps where I differ with the other panelists, possibly including Lionel, is that they will all lament this fact. I don't. I think it is a wonderful thing. Our opponents confront the world with timidity in the hope that the existing political architecture can be tweaked and twisted into coping. Polly Toynbee versus Richard Littlejohn, Labour versus Tory. None of that worked for me, or for 60% of the British people who say there is nobody I can vote for. If you really believe in liberation, this is going to be a struggle. What makes you think that the straight, white, propertied men are going to give it up without a fight? Our society will be torn apart in order to get justice. We need a political map now that allows us to represent the true divisions in our society. One of my daughters said to me when I told her what I was going to say tonight, "Oh, I see, you're channeling Samuel L. Jackson." What the hell do you mean? Well, she said, Sam would just get up and he'd say this: everything's changing. Politics has got to change too. Let's just tear this motherfucker down and start something new.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Fortunately, this isn't being broadcast live on the BBC because there's quite a lot of bad language, I feel, around us, which is to be warned against. Before I call our next speaker up, just to say that I have the results in front of me of your initial votes, which I will be announcing after our fourth speaker has finished. And then once David Lammy has finished, we'll be coming to the floor for your chance to question these brainy folk up here before voting again. But before all that, we'll go to our final speaker against the motion, identity politics is tearing society apart, David Lammy, Labour MP for Tottenham, one of Parliament's most prominent campaigners for social justice, famously led the recent campaign for the Windrush generation to be granted British citizenship. He's fought for justice for the Grenfell Tower families and, of course, has run the high-profile campaign calling on Oxbridge to improve access for students from underrepresented and disadvantaged backgrounds. David, the floor is yours.
Great. So I'm listening to the speakers, and I'm thinking about a young David Lammy, growing up in Tottenham in the 1970s. It's a young David Lammy that looks like Michael Jackson and wants to be Michael Jackson. And that young David Lammy would never have believed that the tide of human progress would bring me here in front of you, able to articulate, to speak, to have the confidence to do that. I was also thinking of another young but a bit older David Lammy who walked into the House of Commons at the beginning of that Tony Blair government. By that point, I looked more like Denzel Washington. This was a period of consensus politics. Clinton, Blair, New Labour. Things were coming together. We had 10 consecutive quarters of growth. And a kind of cool Britannia emerged, where, there were a lot of drugs as well and things, but, dance music. But people loved one another. Here I am, 2019. I now look like Forrest Whitaker. Tomorrow, people will be voting in the European elections, and many will vote for what I see as hard right parties and positions. This is an age of Trump, of Farage, of Jacob Rees-Mogg, of Boris Johnson. And we are accusing identity politics of tearing society apart. The great story of the 20th century was probably democracy. But if there is a second story, theme that arcs that century, surely it is rights. And that by the end of that century, so many human beings who started off at the beginning of the 20th century, subjugated, oppressed, could actually begin to self-actualize in their own lifetimes. Women got the vote, and with the invention of the pill, control over their own bodies. Ethnic minorities colonized. Remember those pink bits of the atlas over so much of the world? Broke off because of the powerful words and behavior of people like Gandhi from that colonization. Workers came from being exploited, birthed movements like the Labour Party, and I still believe at its best, the best progressive cause in our country. And now, same-sex marriage, and those who are LGBT taking their place, when it's only in 1967 that you could be imprisoned because of the person that you love. That is a remarkable story. The story that is the story of the 20th century. And of course that is a story about identity. Because when Martin Luther King spoke, and he talked about judging somebody by the character of their soul, not by the color of their skin. Have we arrived at that? And even though that was a goal, he didn't park his identity at the door to get that goal. And neither did Harvey Milk, fighting for gay rights in San Francisco and beyond, and all those fighting for disability rights. So for me, identity politics is about empathy. It is about dignity. And my God, I look Nigel Farage in the face and I say it's about compassion. Compassion for your fellow human being. So we stand by that progress despite all that we have to do. We're now in a period where those on the right dismiss it. When I raised concerns about who should lead the inquiry into those poor people that died desperately, included a friend of mine on the 20th floor of Grenfell Tower, burned to death, a young woman called Khadija Say. And I raised questions about who should lead that inquiry. Because actually, in the role that I play in public life, someone should say, does it have to be another white, male, privileged, upper-class judge? Not because he can't do a good job. George Scarman did a good job when he led the riots into the Brixton riots. But is there not, in Britain in 2019, an ethnic minority lawyer, or even a woman that could take that role? And I say that at a point in our country where only 7% of the judges are from an ethnic minority background, and we have one woman on our Supreme Court. Progress? So much more to do. And those on the left, of course, class and economic inequality have to be challenged. That's the basis of my politics. But those who fight for rights today do not stand opposed to issues of inequality that exist in our society, just as there were LGBT people who set up solidarity funds to fight for the miners. You can be alongside those in that battle for against inequality in our society. And yes, there are moments when it goes too far. If you're tweeting or writing, white people are trash, kill all men, that is identity politics that I would not want to associate myself with. But let us be clear on the proposition. Let us really single in on what may be tearing our society apart. Populism might well be tearing our society apart. Populism on the hard right and populism on the hard left. Austerity, cuts, brutal cuts to local authorities right up and down the country. The biggest north-south divide since 1911. That may be tearing our society apart. Grim poverty, chronic housing conditions right across this city that means so many people who could be in this audience aren't in this audience. That could be tearing our society apart. Gross inequality, with 44% of the UK's wealth owned by just 10% of our population. 50% of the land in the UK owned by 1% of the population. That could be the proposition. That could be tearing our society apart. But instead, this proposition asks you, blame the Bangladeshi woman, blame the trans man, blame the individual with disability. And then they say they're victims. And we heard that language from Lionel. Victimhood, the victimhood that is being manipulated in our country is a victimhood that's being peddled today by Nigel Farage. It is not the victimhood of the people I just described. So reject this proposition. It is not tearing our society apart. It's an arc that begins with people like Mandela, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Emily Pankhurst. Stand alongside it, because in the age that we are in, there is a big difference between dignity, compassion, and human rights, and the populism that would rip our country asunder.